Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to drain your energy, leaving you exhausted long after the interaction has ended? As we age, our energy becomes even more precious, yet many of us continue giving it away freely to those who deplete, rather than nourish us. The ability to recognize energy-draining personalities isn't about becoming antisocial or unkind. It's about protecting the limited resources we have as we move into our wisdom years. Learning to set healthy boundaries with these individuals isn't selfish. It's a necessary act of self-preservation that allows us to direct our energy toward what truly matters in this important life stage. For many of us who've spent decades being caregivers, peacemakers, and responsible community members, the idea of saying no or limiting time with certain people feels uncomfortable or even wrong. We were raised to be polite, to listen patiently, to help whenever asked, and to never turn away someone in need. These values have shaped our identity and relationships for most of our lives, creating patterns that can be difficult to recognize and even harder to change. Yet continuing these patterns without adjustment in our later years can lead to unnecessary stress, exhaustion, and even resentment, robbing us of the peace and purpose we deserve in this chapter of life. What we often fail to realize is that our capacity for giving changes as we age, requiring us to become more intentional with our energy expenditure. The reserves that once seemed bottomless in our younger years now take longer to replenish, making each interaction more consequential to our overall well-being. This doesn't mean we must become isolated or uninvolved, but rather that we must become wiser about who and what we invite into our daily experience. By learning to recognize the types of people who consistently leave us feeling drained, we can begin making small but significant adjustments to protect our vital energy while still maintaining meaningful connections. This wisdom, the understanding of how to protect our energy as we age, is something rarely discussed yet profoundly important for anyone entering their 60-plus years. It represents a shift from the people-pleasing tendencies many of us have cultivated throughout our lives to a healthier self-awareness that honors our changing needs. The reward for making this shift isn't just greater energy, but also increased clarity about what truly matters, deeper appreciation for genuine connections, and the freedom to fully engage with activities and relationships that bring purpose and joy. These benefits ripple outward, ultimately allowing us to be more present and giving where it counts most. Today, I'll share with you 6 types of people you may need to distance yourself from after 60, not to encourage judgment or rejection, but to help you recognize when boundaries are needed to preserve your well-being. I'll explain why these interactions are particularly draining at this stage of life and offer practical, compassionate ways to protect yourself without burning bridges or creating unnecessary conflict. If you're finding yourself inexplicably tired despite adequate rest, or feeling a sense of heaviness about certain social obligations, this guidance may provide the permission you've been waiting for to make necessary changes. To illustrate this, let me tell you a story about Edwin Mercer, a 65-year-old recently retired literature professor who volunteers at a community center in a small coastal town. With his trusty leather briefcase still in hand 3 months after retirement, Edwin arrives at the bustling center on a crisp autumn morning, old habits still clinging to him like a comfortable sweater. The center hums with activity, seniors engaged in card games, art classes, and animated conversations in every corner. Edwin has found purpose here, coordinating literary events twice weekly. But lately, he's been feeling unusually depleted after each visit, a weariness he can't quite explain. "Good morning, Edwin." Gwen Harper, the center's director, calls out with characteristic enthusiasm as he signs in at the reception desk. At 62, Gwen radiates an energy that seems inexhaustible, her smile as bright as her floral blouse. "I'm so glad you're here. We're Terribly short-staffed for the fundraiser next weekend, and I just knew you'd be willing to take on a few more hours. Perhaps you could lead the book auction and help with setup on Friday too? Edwin feels the familiar pressure building in his chest, the nearly automatic yes forming on his lips before his mind has even processed the request. This inability to decline has followed him throughout his teaching career and now into retirement, leaving him overcommitted and overwhelmed. Before he can respond, however, a gentle voice interrupts the moment. "I'm afraid I need to steal Professor Mercer away, Gwen," says Irene Smith, a 68-year-old widow who has navigated her retirement years with remarkable grace. "I desperately need his literary expertise on something rather urgent." She turns to Edwin with a knowing smile. "Would you mind joining me for coffee across the street? It won't take long. If this conversation about protecting your energy resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to continue our journey of finding wisdom in the later years." As Edwin and Irene walk toward the cafe across from the community center, the morning sunlight casts long shadows behind them. "Thank you for the rescue," Edwin says with a grateful sigh. "I was about to agree to more responsibilities than I could handle. Again." Irene smiles knowingly, her silver hair catching the light as she turns to him. "I recognize that look on your face. It's one I used to wear quite often myself." She adjusts her colorful scarf against the autumn breeze. "After my husband died, I had to learn some difficult lessons about protecting my energy. It seems you might be ready for the same conversation." The cafe welcomes them with the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked goods. Sophia Winters, the 64-year-old owner, waves to them from behind the counter where she's arranging scones on a display plate. Her cafe has become an unofficial gathering place for the town's senior community, a place where wisdom is exchanged as freely as gossip. "Your usual table is open," she calls to Irene, gesturing toward a quiet corner bathed in soft light from the large windows. As they settle into comfortable chairs, Irene studies Edwin's tired eyes. "Tell me," she says gently, "how are you really doing with retirement? Not the polite answer you give everyone else, but the truth." Edwin pauses, surprised by the directness of her question, and even more surprised by his desire to answer honestly. "I thought I'd have more energy," he admits. "Finally, I've eliminated the stress of teaching, grading, faculty meetings, yet I often feel more exhausted now than when I was working full-time. It doesn't make sense." Irene nods as she wraps her hands around her warm mug. "It makes perfect sense, actually. Your energy isn't being drained by work anymore. It's being drained by people." She leans forward slightly, her voice taking on a more instructive tone. "After 60, our energy reserves change. What we could easily give away in our 40s and 50s now takes twice as long to replenish. Yet many of us continue the same patterns of interaction that no longer serve us." She smiles with a hint of mischief. "That's why I've developed what I call my After 60 Survival Guide. Would you like to hear it?" Edwin leans forward, intrigued. "I'd like that very much," he says, his academic curiosity piqued. Irene takes a sip of her coffee. "Before beginning, after decades of being a teacher, then a wife, then a caregiver to my husband during his illness, I had formed the habit of putting everyone else first. When I found myself alone at 60, I was exhausted beyond measure, not just from grief, but from a lifetime of giving without boundaries." She places her mug down deliberately. "That's when I realized I needed to become selective about who received my time and energy. I identified 6 types of people who were consistently draining me, and I began creating gentle distance from them." Sophia approaches their table with a plate of freshly baked scones. "These just came out of the oven," she says, setting them down. "On the house for my favorite customers." She notices the serious expression on Irene's face. "Are you sharing your famous list?" Irene smiles. Edwin here seems ready for it. Sophia nods knowingly. That list changed my life when Irene shared it with me 2 years ago. I'll leave you to it, but I might chime in later if that's all right. She returns to the counter, greeting an elderly couple who've just entered the cafe. The first type of person I learned to create distance from, Irene begins, is what I call the chronic complainer. These individuals find fault in everything. The weather, politics, their health, their family, the community. Nothing is ever right in their world, and they need you to know about every disappointment and grievance. Edwin immediately thinks of his neighbor Victor, a man in his 70s who turns every interaction into a litany of complaints. Their brief driveway conversations invariably leave Edwin feeling as though a cloud has settled over his day. What makes these interactions so draining, Irene continues, is that chronic complainers aren't looking for solutions. If you offer suggestions, they'll explain why nothing will work. They're seeking an audience, not advice. The emotional toll comes from the negativity they transfer to you. It's like a dark energy that attaches itself to your thoughts long after the conversation ends. My neighbor Victor, Edwin says, shaking his head slightly, he caught me getting my mail yesterday and spent 20 minutes detailing everything wrong with his new hearing aids, his daughter's parenting, and the city's road maintenance schedule. I had to take a nap afterward. Irene nods with understanding. That exhaustion is your body's wisdom speaking. It's recognizing that your energy has been siphoned away. She breaks a scone in half, the steam rising between them. The key to dealing with chronic complainers isn't cutting them off entirely. That's rarely necessary or kind. Instead, it's about creating containers for the interaction. Containers, Edwin asks. Time boundaries, Irene explains. When you see Victor collecting his mail, you might wave and say, "Good morning. I can chat for just 2 minutes before I need to head inside for a call." Being specific about time limits helps. Another approach is to gently redirect. When he begins complaining, try saying, "That does sound challenging. On a different note, I just read something interesting about," and shift to a neutral or positive topic. Edwin nods thoughtfully. And if those approaches don't work, then you become suddenly very busy, Irene says with a twinkle in her eye. Having prepared phrases ready can help. I wish I could talk longer, but I need to finish something important. No elaborate explanations needed. Remember, at our age, protecting our peace isn't selfish, it's necessary self-care. The second type, Irene continues after enjoying a bite of her scone, is the nostalgia trapper. From behind the counter, Sophia laughs softly. My sister is the queen of this category. Irene smiles at Sophia before turning back to Edwin. Nostalgia trappers keep pulling you backward into reminiscing about the past. Some reflection on good memories can be nourishing, but these individuals refuse to acknowledge who you are becoming now. They constantly reference the good old days and seem uncomfortable or uninterested in your current interests or future plans. They keep you anchored to old identities, Sophia adds, approaching their table again. My sister still introduces me as my sister the marketing executive, though I've owned this cafe for 7 years. When we get together, all she wants to talk about are my corporate days, as if this entire chapter of my life isn't quite real or valid to her. Exactly. Irene nods. And while most of us enjoy occasional trips down memory lane, constantly being pulled into the past prevents us from fully inhabiting our present and creating our future. It subtly undermines the new identities we're forming in retirement. Considers this. I have a monthly lunch with former colleagues from the university. Lately, I've been noticing how every conversation revolves around department politics or anecdotes from years ago. When I mention my volunteer work or my new interest in bird watching, they seem almost dismissive, like these pursuits aren't serious enough compared to academia. That's the essence of it, Irene confirms. They're comfortable with Professor Mercer, but have little interest in Edwin the birdwatcher or community volunteer. The energy drain comes from feeling subtly invalidated in your evolution. So how do you handle these nostalgia trappers? Edwin asks. First, recognize that their attachment to the past often reflects their own discomfort with change, Irene explains. It's rarely about you. Then, be gently persistent in bringing conversations to the present. When they start pulling you back, you might say, "Those were interesting times, but I'm really excited about what I'm doing now." If they continue dismissing your current interests, you might need to be more direct. "I value our history together, but I'm also enjoying this new chapter. I'd love for you to know that part of me too." And if they still resist, Edwin asks, then you may need to adjust how much time you spend with them, or in what context, Irene says. Perhaps those monthly lunches become quarterly, or you invite one receptive colleague to join you for a bird-watching outing instead. The goal isn't to abandon old friends, but to create space for relationships that honor who you are becoming, not just who you were. The cafe door opens, letting in a burst of cool air and a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a worried expression. He scans the room, his face lighting up when he spots Edwin and Irene. "Speaking of energy drains," Irene murmurs, "here comes a perfect example of our third type." Frank Patterson makes his way to their table, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. At 72, he carries himself with the authority of his former position as a bank manager, though retirement has softened his once rigid demeanor. "Edwin, thank goodness you're here," Frank begins, his voice tense. "I'm in the middle of a complete disaster with my son Michael. He's suggesting we postpone our family vacation to August instead of July because of his work schedule, and it's throwing everything into chaos. The rental properties will all be booked by then, the weather is unbearable in August, and my medication schedule makes travel difficult later in the summer." Edwin feels the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. For years, he's been Frank's sounding board and unofficial mediator in family matters. "I'm sure it can be worked out, Frank," he begins automatically. Irene observes the interaction quietly, giving Edwin a subtle glance as if to say, "Watch what's happening here." "You need to call Michael for me," Frank continues, hardly pausing for breath. "He listens to you. Explain why this change won't work. And while you're at it, could you look at these rental listings?" He pulls out his tablet, already opening his browser. "I need a second opinion on which location would be best if we're forced into August." Edwin glances at Irene, suddenly aware of the dynamic playing out. He straightens slightly in his chair. "Frank," he says with newfound firmness, "this sounds challenging, but I think this is something for you and Michael to discuss directly. I'm happy to be a supportive friend, but I can't step into the middle of family decisions." Frank looks momentarily stunned, then slightly offended. "But you always help with these things. I counted on you having the time now that you're retired." "I'm happy to listen and offer support," Edwin clarifies, "but not to take on solving the problem. That's different." After a few more attempts to enlist Edwin's direct intervention, Frank eventually leaves with a diminished sense of urgency about his crisis, promising to call Michael himself. As the door closes behind him, Irene smiles approvingly at Edwin. "You just encountered and handled the crisis manufacturer, our third energy-draining type." Edwin exhales, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief. "Frank has always been dramatic, but I've never quite seen the pattern so clearly. Every issue is an emergency requiring immediate attention, usually my attention. Crisis manufacturers live in a constant state of urgency," Irene explains. "Every challenge, no matter how minor, becomes catastrophic in their telling. The weather forecast, a scheduling conflict, a misunderstanding, all are presented as disasters requiring immediate mobilization of resources, usually yours." "But why?" Edwin asks. "Frank is intelligent and capable. He managed a bank for 30 years, for heaven's sake." "The drama serves him," Irene explains. It makes his concerns seem more important, guarantees a response, and often transfers responsibility to others. Most crisis manufacturers developed this pattern long ago because it worked. People rushed to help, took over troublesome tasks, and provided the attention or care they craved. And the energy drain comes from the artificial sense of responsibility they create, Edwin realizes. When Frank arrived, I immediately felt like I needed to solve his problem, even though it's clearly an issue between him and his son. Exactly. Irene nods. Crisis manufacturers activate our helping instinct, but then they consume disproportionate amounts of our emotional and mental energy for situations that aren't true emergencies. At our age, we need to be more discerning about where we direct that limited energy. How did I do with my response? Edwin asks. Wonderfully, Irene smiles. The key with crisis manufacturers is exactly what you did. Refuse to take ownership of their problem while still showing care for them as a person. You maintained the boundary between support and responsibility. With practice, this becomes easier and the guilt diminishes. Edwin reflects on this insight, feeling a new awareness dawning. It's remarkable how clearly I can see these patterns when they're named. I've been dealing with these dynamics for years without really understanding them. Most of us have, Irene says. We weren't taught to recognize these interactions for what they are, energy exchanges. Some leave us feeling lighter, and some leave us depleted. After 60, we simply can't afford as many depleting exchanges if we want to maintain our health and pursue what matters to us. Sophia returns to their table with fresh coffee. How's the education coming along? She asks with a warm smile. We've covered 3 types so far, Irene replies. Edwin just had a live demonstration with Frank on crisis manufacturing. Sophia chuckles knowingly. Ah, Frank and his emergencies. He once had me rearrange the cafe seating because he had a critically important meeting that couldn't possibly take place near the windows due to potential glare on his tablet. She refreshes their cups. What's next on your list, Irene? The validation vampires? Indeed, Irene nods, thanking Sophia for the coffee. The 4th type we need to create boundaries with after 60 is what Sophia just mentioned, the validation vampire. These individuals constantly seek approval, reassurance, and emotional support without reciprocity. Every interaction revolves around their needs for validation, leaving little room for mutual exchange. Edwin immediately thinks of his former colleague Margaret, who calls weekly with questions about her teaching methods, writing projects, or departmental decisions. Conversations that can stretch for an hour but rarely include any questions about Edwin's life or well-being. The hallmark of validation vampires, Irene continues, is how one-sided the relationship feels. You leave interactions feeling emotionally drained because they've fed on your supportive energy without offering anything in return. They need constant reassurance about their choices, talents, or appearance, creating an imbalance that becomes increasingly exhausting as we age. My colleague Margaret, Edwin nods. She called yesterday with a quick question about a lecture. She's preparing a 45-minute monologue that ended without her asking a single question about my retirement or how I'm doing. Classic validation vampire behavior, Irene confirms. The challenge with these relationships is that they often formed during periods when we had more energy to give in our professional roles or younger years. The other person grew accustomed to the dynamic, and now it's difficult to shift. How do you handle them without seeming cold or uncaring? Edwin asks. Margaret is genuinely insecure, not malicious. That's an important distinction, Irene acknowledges. Most energy-draining people aren't intentionally depleting you. They're acting from their own needs and established patterns. The approach with validation vampires is to create more balance through gentle redirections and time limits. Irene continues explaining, you might say, I have 15 minutes to talk now, then I need to get to an appointment. This creates a container for how much validation you're able to provide. During the conversation, after offering some support, you can redirect. That's my thought on your lecture. By the way, I've been meaning to tell you about something interesting I've been working on. This signals that you expect the exchange to go both ways. And if they steer it right back to themselves, Edwin asks, then you have valuable information about whether this relationship has the capacity for balance, Irene says gently. Some people are so accustomed to one-way interactions that they genuinely don't recognize what they're doing. In those cases, you might need to be more direct. I've noticed our conversations focus primarily on your work. Value our friendship and would enjoy having more mutual exchanges where we both share and support each other. Edwin nods thoughtfully. That seems reasonable, though not easy. Few worthwhile changes are easy, Irene smiles, but they're necessary. If we want to protect our energy for what matters most in these precious years. Edwin takes a moment to absorb these insights, looking around the cafe with new awareness. It's remarkable how many interactions I've simply accepted without question, even as they left me feeling depleted. I never considered that I could or should set boundaries around my energy. Most of us weren't raised to think about relationships in terms of energy exchange, Irene says. We were taught to be polite, helpful, and available, especially those of us in caregiving or service professions. Recognizing these patterns isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming wise stewards of the limited energy we have in our later years. Edwin nods slowly. I've been feeling guilty about needing more rest lately, as if it's some character flaw that I'm more tired after certain interactions. But perhaps it's not about weakness at all. Perhaps it's simply about recognizing the cost of these exchanges and making conscious choices. Exactly, Irene says warmly. Once you recognize these patterns, you can't unsee them, and that awareness alone will begin to shift how you engage with the energy-draining people in your life. Finished with their scones and ready to return to the community center, Edwin and Irene gather their belongings. As they prepare to leave the cafe, Edwin feels a new lightness in his step, despite the weight of new knowledge. Understanding these dynamics has already given him a sense of agency he hadn't realized was missing. Walking back across the street, Irene continues her explanation. The fifth type of person to create boundaries with is what I call the boundary bulldozer. These individuals consistently disregard personal limits, showing up unannounced, calling at inappropriate hours, asking intrusive questions, or pushing for more involvement than you can comfortably give. Like Gwen at the center, Edwin realizes, thinking of the enthusiastic director who had cornered him earlier. Precisely, Irene confirms. Boundary bulldozers often come disguised as enthusiastic collaborators or people who just need a little help. They use phrases like, "It will only take a minute," or "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," to override your hesitation. What makes them particularly draining, Irene continues as they cross the street, is how they place the burden of saying no squarely on your shoulders, often making you feel guilty for having limits at all. They create situations where declining feels uncomfortable or even impossible. They reach the community center's entrance, pausing before going inside. The key to dealing with boundary bulldozers is to establish clear limits before they can bulldoze them, Irene explains. With someone like Gwen, you might say, "I've set aside Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 12 for volunteering. I'm not available outside those hours." Being specific and consistent is crucial. Edwin considers this advice. What about when they push anyway? Gwen has a talent for making me feel like I'm letting down the entire community if I don't take on extra responsibilities. Then you practice kind but firm repetition, Irene says. No elaborate explanations or apologies, just a calm restatement of your boundary. "I understand the fundraiser is important, but my volunteer hours remain Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 12. The consistency eventually trains them to respect your limits. Edwin takes a deep breath, preparing to re-enter the community center with his new awareness. This will take practice. All worthwhile skills do, Irene smiles encouragingly. But I've found that setting boundaries with boundary bulldozers gets easier with time, especially when you see how much energy it preserves for the things that truly matter to you. If you're finding value in these insights about protecting your energy after 60, please subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating this important life stage with dignity and purpose. As they enter the community center, the afternoon bustle has begun. A painting class is finishing up in one corner, while a book discussion group gathers in another. Gwen spots them immediately and approaches with her clipboard and ready smile. "There you are, Edwin. I've been looking for you. I've put your name down for the fundraiser committee. We meet tomorrow at 2 p.m., and I've told the book auction team you'll coordinate with them this afternoon." She says this with such cheerful certainty that it sounds like a done deal rather than a request. Edwin glances at Irene, drawing strength from their recent conversation. "Gwen," he says calmly, "I haven't agreed to either of those commitments. My volunteer hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 12, as we discussed when I started. I'm afraid I won't be able to take on additional responsibilities right now." Gwen's smile falters slightly. "But we're really counting on you, Edwin. No one else has your experience with literature for the book auction. It won't take much time, I promise." "I understand the need," Edwin says, maintaining his calm tone, "but my schedule doesn't allow for it right now. I'd be happy to provide a list of suggestions for the book auction during my regular volunteer hours on Thursday." Gwen looks as though she wants to push further, but something in Edwin's steady gaze stops her. "Well, all right then. I'll let the auction team know you'll have some suggestions on Thursday." She walks away, her posture suggesting mild disappointment. Irene gives Edwin an approving nod. "Well done. That's exactly how you handle a boundary bulldozer." Edwin exhales, feeling both guilty and relieved. It felt uncomfortable, but also right somehow, like I was standing up for something important. "You were," Irene confirms. "You were honoring your needs and the reality of your energy limits. That's not selfishness, it's wisdom." As they walk further into the center, they pass a small group gathered around a table. An older man with impeccably combed grey hair and a tweed jacket is holding forth to several listeners. "The problem with how they're running this place now," he's saying in a carrying voice, "is that they've forgotten the proper way to organize community events. In my day, we had standards for these things. And here, we have a perfect example of our sixth type," Irene murmurs to Edwin, "the judgment dispenser." Edwin recognizes the man as Lawrence Wellington, a retired school administrator known for his strong opinions and critical comments. They find seats at a nearby table where they can observe while Irene continues her explanation. "Judgment dispensers," she says quietly, "are individuals who constantly criticize choices, appearances, or lifestyles. They offer unsolicited, helpful suggestions that are actually thinly veiled criticisms. These interactions are particularly draining because they activate our insecurities and defensive responses." Edwin nods, watching as Lawrence corrects someone's use of a term and then criticizes the center's choice of refreshments. "He does this every time I see him. Last week, he spent 15 minutes explaining why my retirement timing was questionable at best, and why the literary discussion group I've organized is not challenging enough for serious minds." "And how did you feel afterward?" Irene asks knowingly. "Deflated," Edwin admits. "I found myself second-guessing the reading list I'd created, wondering if it was too simplistic. It took days to shake off that feeling and rediscover my enthusiasm for the project. That's the insidious nature of judgment dispensers," Irene explains. "They plant seeds of doubt that continue draining your energy long after the interaction ends. They position themselves as authorities whose standards you fail to meet, triggering that deep human desire for approval. What makes some people so critical? Edwin wonders, observing Lawrence's continuing commentary. Often it's their own insecurity, Irene suggests. Criticizing others creates a sense of superiority that temporarily soothes their own self-doubt. In Lawrence's case, I suspect retirement has diminished his sense of authority, and judgment becomes his way of reclaiming that position. That's actually rather sad, Edwin reflects. It is, Irene agrees, which is why approaching judgment dispensers with compassion matters, even as we protect ourselves from their energy drain. And how do we do that? Edwin asks, watching Lawrence gather his things, seemingly having exhausted his immediate audience. First, recognize that their judgments reflect their issues, not your worth, Irene explains. Then, you have several options depending on the situation. You can simply acknowledge their comment without engaging, "That's an interesting perspective," or "I'll consider that." No defense needed. What if they persist? Edwin asks, as Lawrence begins making his way toward their table, having spotted them. Then you can be more direct, Irene says quickly. Something like, "I've considered your view, but I'm comfortable with my choice." Or even, "I notice you often have concerns about how things are done. What approach would you suggest instead?" This sometimes shifts them from criticism to having to provide solutions, which many aren't prepared to do. Lawrence reaches their table, standing over them with a critical eye. "Edwin," he says with a nod, "I heard you turned down Gwen's request for help with the fundraiser. Rather surprising, considering your supposed commitment to literary education in the community. One would think a man with your background would prioritize such events." Edwin feels the familiar sting of judgment, but recalls Irene's advice. He takes a breath before responding. "Hello, Lawrence. I'm focused on the specific commitments I've made to the center, which include the Thursday literature group I lead. We're discussing Steinbeck next week. You're welcome to join us." Lawrence sniffs dismissively. Steinbeck? Rather elementary, isn't it? I would have expected something more challenging for mature minds. Instead of becoming defensive about his choice, Edwin simply nods. That's an interesting perspective. We find his work offers accessible depth for varied discussion. What author would you suggest for a community group with diverse reading backgrounds? Lawrence blinks, clearly not expecting to be asked for a constructive alternative. Well, perhaps Dostoevsky or Proust would be more intellectually stimulating. That's worth considering for future selections, Edwin says pleasantly. Would you be interested in leading a discussion on either author? Your expertise would be valuable. Looking suddenly uncomfortable at the prospect of actual responsibility rather than critique, Lawrence murmurs something about checking his schedule and moves away to find easier targets for his judgments. Irene smiles approvingly. Perfect redirection. You didn't take on his judgment, and you shifted the dynamic from criticism to potential contribution. That often reveals whether someone is truly interested in improvement or simply in dispensing judgment. Edwin feels a surprising sense of accomplishment. It felt good not to be knocked off balance by his criticism. Normally, I would have spent the next hour mentally defending my choice of Steinbeck and wondering if the group does find it too simplistic. That's exactly the energy drain we're working to prevent. Irene nods. Every time you protect your boundaries with these 6 types of people, you're preserving energy for what truly matters to you. As the afternoon progresses, Edwin assists with setting up for an evening poetry reading, now working with a clearer sense of his boundaries. When another volunteer asks if he can stay late to help clean up, he politely declines rather than automatically agreeing as he would have before. During a break, he and Irene find a quiet corner to continue their conversation. Beyond identifying these 6 types, Irene explains, there are some general principles that help protect your energy after 60, regardless of who you're interacting with. Edwin leans forward, eager to hear more. Such as, first, Pay attention to how you feel after spending time with specific people, Irene advises. Your body offers wisdom through your energy levels. If you consistently feel depleted after certain interactions, that's valuable information, not something to ignore or push through. Edwin nods, thinking of how tired he often feels after volunteering despite enjoying the activities themselves. I've noticed that some days here leave me more exhausted than others, depending on who I've interacted with extensively. Exactly, Irene confirms. Our bodies signal when energy is being drained, but we've been conditioned to override those signals in favor of politeness or obligation. Learning to honor that wisdom is crucial after 60. What else? Edwin asks. Create buffer zones around interactions you know will be demanding, Irene suggests. If you must engage with energy-draining individuals, and sometimes we must, especially with family, plan recovery time afterward. Don't schedule another activity immediately following. Give yourself space to restore. Edwin contemplates this advice. I've never really thought about scheduling recovery time. It seems so deliberate. It is deliberate, Irene smiles. That's precisely the point. As we age, we need to become more intentional about energy management. The spontaneity of our younger years, when we could push through fatigue without consequence, isn't sustainable in our 60s and beyond. As she continues, another principle is learning to distinguish between meaningful discomfort and unnecessary energy drains. Some challenging interactions are worth the energy investment because they lead to growth, deeper connections, or important outcomes. Others simply deplete without purpose. How do you tell the difference? Edwin asks. Ask yourself whether the discomfort serves something you truly value, Irene explains. A difficult conversation with an adult child that clears misunderstandings might be temporarily draining, but ultimately strengthening to the relationship. That's meaningful discomfort. Listening to a neighbor complain about the same issues for the 15th time with no resolution in sight is an unnecessary drain. Edwin considers this distinction. So it's not about avoiding all challenging interactions, but about being selective based on whether they serve something important to me. Precisely, Irene nods. It's about becoming a wise steward of your limited energy rather than spending it indiscriminately. As afternoon transitions to evening, more seniors arrive for the poetry reading. Edwin notices a woman about his age struggling to carry several books and a folder of papers. He moves to help her, taking some of the books. Thank you, she says warmly. I'm Helen Barnes, the guest poet for tonight's reading. These are heavier than I anticipated. Edwin Mercer, he introduces himself. I help with the literary events. Here, let me show you to the reading area. As they walk, Helen asks thoughtful questions about the community center and Edwin's involvement. She listens with genuine interest to his responses, occasionally sharing brief observations about her own experiences with community arts programs. Edwin finds himself energized rather than drained by the exchange. Irene, observing from across the room, catches Edwin's eye with an approving nod, as if to say, "Notice the difference in how this interaction feels." After helping Helen set up for her reading, Edwin rejoins Irene. That was refreshing, he comments, surprised by his own energy level after the interaction. That's what balanced energy exchange feels like, Irene explains. Helen was genuinely curious, shared the conversational space rather than dominating it, and showed appreciation for your assistance without excessive demands. Those interactions actually energize rather than deplete. The contrast is remarkable. Edwin acknowledges, I feel more awake now than I did an hour ago, despite being physically active helping her set up. That's the final principle I want to share, Irene says. As important as it is to recognize energy-draining people, it's equally important to identify and prioritize energy-giving relationships. These are the people who leave you feeling inspired, appreciated, and more yourself. Edwin thinks about this. So the goal isn't just to create boundaries with draining individuals, but to intentionally seek out and nurture relationships that replenish us. Exactly, Irene confirms. Many of us were taught to endure difficult people as a virtue, but rarely encouraged to actively cultivate nourishing connections. After 60, this balance becomes even more crucial to our well-being. The center begins filling with people for the poetry reading. Edwin and Irene find seats near the back, their conversation continuing in hushed tones. "Something I've been wondering," Edwin says quietly. "What about family members who fall into these categories? Setting boundaries with acquaintances or community. Connections seems manageable, but what about an adult child who's a chronic complainer or a sibling who's a judgment dispenser? Family relationships do add complexity," Irene acknowledges. "The emotional bonds and history make boundaries more challenging. With family, I found that smaller, more gradual adjustments work better than dramatic changes." She elaborates. "For instance, with a complaining adult child, you might say, I notice we often focus on challenges when we talk. I'd love to hear more about what's going well for you too." Or with judging siblings, you might try, "I value our relationship." Too much to debate this further. Let's find something we both enjoy discussing. "And if they don't respond to these redirections," Edwin asks, "then more structured boundaries might be necessary," Irene explains, like limiting visits to certain time frames, having regular activities that naturally constrain the interaction, or in some cases, involving a family therapist to help navigate particularly difficult dynamics. Edwin nods thoughtfully. "It's not easy, but necessary for preservation." Exactly, Irene agrees. And remember, setting boundaries isn't about rejecting people. It's about creating healthier patterns of interaction. Often, as we change our responses, relationships naturally shift into better balance. The poetry reading begins, and they pause their conversation to listen. Helen's poems speak eloquently of transitions, loss, and discovering new purpose in later years. One poem particularly resonates with Edwin, a piece about discarding old expectations to make room for unexpected joy. After the reading, as attendees mingle and enjoy refreshments, Edwin notices Lawrence approaching Helen with a critical expression. He watches as the poet listens briefly to what appears to be Lawrence's judgment of her work, then responds with a warm smile and a brief comment that seems to deflect rather than engage with the criticism. Lawrence soon moves on, looking slightly deflated, while Helen continues greeting others with undiminished enthusiasm. "Did you see that?" Edwin whispers to Irene. "Helen just handled Lawrence perfectly. He didn't seem to affect her at all." "I noticed," Irene smiles. "Some people have mastered the art of energy protection naturally. They recognize draining dynamics instantly and redirect without becoming entangled." As the evening winds down, Edwin helps with some light cleanup, careful not to overextend beyond what he had agreed to do. He feels a new awareness of his energy levels and the various interactions that have either depleted or enhanced them throughout the day. When most attendees have left, Helen approaches Edwin and Irene. "Thank you for your help earlier," she says to Edwin. "The reading went beautifully, and I appreciate how welcoming this community is." She turns to Irene. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Irene Smith." Irene extends her hand. "Your poems about transition were particularly moving. They captured something essential about this stage of life." Helen smiles gratefully. "That means a lot. It took me years to find the words for these experiences. Are you both regulars here at the center?" A pleasant conversation follows, with all three contributing equally and showing genuine interest in each other's perspectives. When Helen mentions that she leads a writing workshop at another community center nearby, both Edwin and Irene express interest in attending. "I'd love to see you there," Helen says warmly. "It's a supportive group focused on writing about life transitions. Here's the information." She hands them each a small flyer from her folder. After exchanging goodbyes with Helen, Edwin and Irene prepare to leave the center. That, Irene says with satisfaction, is how energy-giving connections often begin, unexpectedly, through a natural alignment of interests and mutual respect. I'm looking forward to her workshop, Edwin admits. It feels good to anticipate an interaction rather than dreading it. That's another sign of healthy energy exchange. Irene nods, anticipation rather than apprehension. As they collect their belongings, Edwin pauses, suddenly realizing something. I almost forgot my briefcase, he says, glancing around. The one you brought this morning. I think you left it in the administrative office after helping Gwen with those catalog entries, Irene recalls. They walk to the office, finding the leather briefcase sitting beside the desk where Edwin had been working earlier. He picks it up, feeling its familiar weight, then looks at it thoughtfully. You know, he says slowly, I don't actually need to carry this anymore. It's just habit from decades of teaching. I don't have papers to grade or lectures to prepare. Irene watches him with understanding. Old patterns can be comforting, even when they no longer serve us. Edwin runs his hand over the worn leather, appreciating the memories it holds, then deliberately sets it back down. Perhaps it's time to let some old patterns go. Someone else might make better use of this. Are you sure? Irene asks gently. Edwin nods, feeling a surprising lightness in his decision. Yes, it represents a way of being that required me to carry everyone else's needs and expectations. I think I'm ready for something different, perhaps something that leaves my hands free. They walk out of the center together into the early evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. The briefcase remains behind, a small but significant gesture of Edwin's shifting relationship with his energy and boundaries. What's next in your After 60 survival guide? Edwin asks as they pause on the sidewalk. Learning to say no without guilt. Irene smiles, but I think you've already begun that lesson today. I have, Edwin agrees, and it feels like the beginning of something important. As they prepare to go their separate ways, Edwin expresses his gratitude. Thank you, Irene. I came to the center today feeling inexplicably drained. I'm leaving with a clearer understanding of why, and more importantly, what I can do about it. The awareness is the first step, Irene assures him. From here, it gets easier with practice. Your energy is precious, Edwin. It deserves to be protected and directed toward what truly matters to you in these years. Edwin nods thoughtfully. I'm beginning to understand that. It's not selfishness, it's necessary stewardship of limited resources. Exactly, Irene smiles, and the wonderful paradox is that by protecting your energy, you actually have more to give to the people and purposes that truly matter. If this conversation about protecting your energy has resonated with you, please consider liking this video to help others discover these important insights. As the days pass following his conversation with Irene, Edwin begins implementing small changes in his interactions. He politely limits his time with Victor the complaining neighbor, redirects nostalgic colleagues toward present interests, and establishes clear volunteer hours at the community center. Each boundary feels uncomfortable at first, then gradually more natural, like exercising an atrophied muscle that strengthens with use. The most noticeable change comes in his energy levels. By protecting himself from unnecessary drains, Edwin discovers he has more vitality for pursuits that truly matter to him. The bird-watching hobby he'd barely had energy to explore now becomes a morning ritual, bringing unexpected joy and new connections with fellow enthusiasts. His literary discussion group flourishes as he brings renewed enthusiasm to each session, no longer depleted by boundary violations before he even begins. 1 month after their initial conversation, Edwin and Irene meet again at Sophia's cafe. The autumn light has softened into early winter, but the cafe remains a warm haven of connection and conversation. Edwin arrives without his briefcase, a change that has become permanent and symbolic of his transformation. "You look different," Sophia remarks as she brings their coffee to the table. "There's a lightness about you that wasn't there before." Edwin smiles, realizing she's right. "I feel different. Establishing these boundaries hasn't been easy. There's still guilt sometimes when I say no or limit my time with certain people. But the difference in my energy and clarity is remarkable." "The guilt diminishes with time," Irene assures him. "It's the residue of old patterns, not an indication that you're doing something wrong." Edwin nods thoughtfully. "I've noticed something interesting. As I've become more selective with my energy, the quality of what I can offer has actually improved. My contributions at the center are more focused, my connections with others more genuine. It's as though by giving less broadly, I can give more deeply where it matters." "That's the paradox of boundaries," Irene agrees. "They appear to separate us, but healthy ones actually enable more meaningful connection. By preserving your energy, you have more authentic presence to offer." Edwin shares how he's applied Irene's wisdom to each of the 6 types of energy-draining people in his life, making small adjustments that have yielded significant results. He's not eliminated these relationships entirely, with the exception of one particularly toxic critic, but has transformed how he engages with them. "The most surprising outcome," he admits, "has been how some relationships have actually improved with boundaries. Frank seems to respect me more now that I don't automatically take on solving his family dramas. And my former colleague has begun asking about my life after I gently pointed out the one-sided nature of our conversations. People often rise to meet the standards we set," Irene observes. "Not everyone, of course. Some will drift away when their patterns are no longer accommodated. But many relationships have the capacity to evolve into healthier forms when we lead that change." As they prepare to leave, Edwin expresses his gratitude once more. "You've given me a gift beyond measure, Irene. Not just more energy, but a framework for protecting what makes these years meaningful." "Pass it along," Irene smiles. "That's how wisdom grows." Edwin walks home through the park, noticing the winter birds gathering at the feeders he's recently installed. He stops to watch them, appreciating this moment of quiet observation that his newfound energy makes possible. The path ahead feels open with possibility rather than burdened by obligation, a profound shift in how he experiences his days. What about you? As you navigate your own journey beyond 60, how might protecting your energy change what's possible in your life? Which of the 6 types of energy-draining people do you recognize in your own circle, and what small boundary might you establish? This week is an experiment in self-preservation. Perhaps you'll begin with time limits for interactions you know are depleting, or practice gentle redirections when conversations become one-sided or negative. Maybe you'll experiment with buffer zones between demanding activities, or simply pay closer attention to how different people and situations affect your energy levels. Remember that setting boundaries isn't about withdrawal from life or relationships. It's about engaging more intentionally, directing your precious energy toward what truly matters in this important chapter. It's about recognizing that your time and presence are valuable resources to be shared wisely, not indiscriminately. The wisdom of protecting your energy after 60 isn't taught in retirement planning seminars or healthcare checkups. Yet it may be one of the most important factors in creating a fulfilling, purposeful later life. By becoming more selective about who and what receives your energy, you create space for new growth, deeper connections, and unexpected joys. Like Edwin discovering his passion for birdwatching once he stopped depleting himself with unnecessary energy drains. Start small. Notice how you feel after different interactions. Practice saying, "I'll need to think about that," instead of immediate agreement. Create containers for potentially draining exchanges. Most importantly, Release the guilt that may arise as you honor your own needs alongside others. You've spent decades giving. Now is the time to become a wise steward of your energy, directing it toward what brings meaning and joy. The people who truly love you will adjust to these changes, perhaps even finding greater depth in your more intentional presence. Those who resist your boundaries are revealing important information about the nature of your relationship. Information that deserves your attention. What remains when unnecessary energy drains are removed from your life? What becomes possible when you protect your most precious resource? The answer is different for each of us, but the journey of discovery is one well worth taking as we embrace the unique opportunities of our wisdom years. If you found value in these insights about protecting your energy after 60, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating this important stage of life with dignity and purpose.